get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
We haven't
This is so
we
awesome.
are an open culture that believes
actually
in
a big piece of
importance.
this
That process that a developer, or let's say
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Ask an OpenShift Administrator Office Hours live stream. I am your host, Andrew Sullivan, Technical Marketing Manager with the OpenShift Business Unit, and I am joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, Mr. Johnny Rickard.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going great. It's another beautiful Red Hat Wednesday. And
Always.
now I'm hoping that my stream here doesn't crash because I'm getting an error in the interface. What's the worst that happens, right?
I saw that too. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So long as it's both of us, right? Yeah. We'll all go down at the same time. Hello everyone. Welcome to the stream this week. I hope that it has been a exciting and productive week since the last time we talked. This week we are joined by me, myself, and Johnny. We'll be running the show again this week. We don't have a guest, but we have a pretty interesting topic. This is something that we were both kind of scratching our heads after the stream last week, and we're thinking, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to think about? And I don't know if it was a bolt of lightning. I don't even remember what caused me to think of this, but it was like, wait, we can just talk to the fields, right? And so we talked a little bit about some topics, and I ended up sending some emails out to various large distros, large email chains, or email lists inside of Red Hat, and asked some questions about, in particular, like what are some things that either you recommend or you see customers doing basically universally. We sometimes, and let me think of how to say this. Sometimes you'll hear them called best practices, but I think we shy away from using the term best practices. And the reason for that is because best practices are really like they're a majority thing, right? It's where, at least 51% of people maybe should do something like this. And so they can be confusing, especially if you're doing something that is perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a very, good, optimal thing to do. It's just not for everyone. So I've tried to stay away from the term best practices and instead call it like recommendations or common things that are happening. It was really hard to come up with a terse stream title for this stream. But Johnny, you were a consultant for a long time, right? I don't know about your experiences with the term best practices.
Yeah. So for a while, I think initially it was like it wasn't a big deal, and then it became taboo to talk about it. And so then like industry standard or like whatever kind of like common name we could give it to where it was like it was clear without having to explain like, okay, it's best practice.
And I'm always hesitant to convey or construe anytime anything is like nothing is mandatory. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I shouldn't say that, right? What's the thing about always, never, use always and never? So of course, it's mandatory to have things like etcd or you can't replace it with something else inside of OpenShift. But like there are a few, very, very, very few, like hard, fast, you must do this type of thing. Beyond that, it's all situational. It's all depending on what you're trying to do, what you want to do with your applications, with your users, so on and so forth. So,
yeah, I would round that up with my customers with like, I'm not here to tell you no, but I'm here to strongly discourage you from doing something like that, and it's ultimately up to them to make that decision because it's their cluster and they have to live with it.
Yeah. So hello everyone in the chat, Chandler, Tiger, Korak, our Hope 9. So it's good to see everybody today. I love that our chat has been much more interactive. Basically in the new year, right? It kind of picked up in 2022 here, and it's really refreshing to see everybody interacting and chatting. So thank you all. So before we get lost in chit chat here, let's talk about some of our top of mind topics. And I accidentally came up with kind of a long list today. I don't want to spend too much time because I know we want to get to our topic. So let's do these a little bit rapid fire. So first, a couple of logistical things. Reminder that tomorrow is the What's Next presentation from product management team. So the What's Next presentation is the roadmap presentation. So you'll see what's going to be coming in 4.11, 4.12, 4.13. But just remember, the further out we get, the more, the more likely it is to change. So they do their best effort to predict what's going to happen, but we never actually know for sure. So that is tomorrow, April 14th at 10 o'clock in the morning Eastern time. So please adjust for your time zones appropriately. It'll be recorded, so you can find it in perpetuity here on YouTube. We also have a nice little quick link. It's openshift.com/next and new. All one word, no spaces. And that takes you directly to the landing page that has the current versions of the what's new and what's next presentations. So, Johnny, I think you'll be here. I'll be here for sure, answering any questions, stuff like that. Usually, Mike Foster from the ACS team is here. I think Christian will be joining us as well. So, if you have any questions, if you just want to chat about the roadmap while that's going on, we'll be here.
Yep, for sure.
Also, just a reminder that coming up in less than a month now is Red Hat Summit. So Summit is a hybrid event this year. So there is some in-person, some virtual. I would say the vast majority of people will probably be virtual again this year. But they'll be talking about a lot of the stuff that's coming up in Red Hat, not just OpenShift, but Red Hat as a whole. And it's the usual Summit keynote presentations and all the exciting stuff going on there. So if you are interested in that, if you haven't registered yet, definitely go ahead and do that. It's pretty simple, redhat.com/summit. All right, let's talk about some actual tangible things instead of logistic things. So one, and let me share my screen here. Let's see here. All right. So the first one that I want to talk about here is we've been talking about for 2-3 weeks now, Johnny. This etcd data inconsistency issue.
Yep.
So again, Red Hat has become aware of a potential data inconsistency issue present in etcd versions 3.5.0 through 3.5.2, which is used in OpenShift 4.9 and 4.10. So as of right now, upgrades are still blocked between 4.8 and 4.9. You can still use the fast channel to update from 4.9 to 4.10. It is not yet unstable, but that is not blocked, however. So the good news here is that I was looking through various BZs and other things this morning, and it looks like there is a fix that might be shipping in 4.9.28. So let me grab this link from over here. So this is the errata that was shipped. So you can see bug fix advisory. This went out today, the 13th. And if we scroll on down through here, so OpenShift Container Platform 4.9.28. And as we go down towards the bottom, we have this fix here for the potential etcd inconsistent revision in data. So 4.9.28 is in fast, which means that it is a generally available, right? It's a fully supported release if you want to do that upgrade today. I don't think that they have unblocked, so even if you do upgrade today, you still won't be able to do that update. And I don't know when that will be coming for 4.8. But yeah, it looks like we're on the cusp of getting some fixes here, assuming everything works as they expect it to, as they hope it to. So good news for everyone.
Yeah, nice.
Data inconsistency, data loss is, as a former storage guy, terrifying. We avoid that like the plague.
Oh, yeah.
Any highlights on Red Hat OpenShift learning subscriptions? If you can provide some clarification on that, correct? Because I'm not quite sure what you might be referring to. So learning subscriptions, you can get a developer entitlement to OpenShift through if you have a developer account, right? It's the standard 16 node thing. I have not checked recently or followed up to see if they have unblocked the issues that were preventing you from basically assigning it to a self-supported cluster inside of there and getting away from the eval designation. But as far as I know, there's nothing wrong with leaving it as an eval. You'll still be able to connect and get updates and stuff like that if you're using an eval license. If you look in the console.redhat.com interface, it's angry at you. So long as you're sticking to the developer entitlement restrictions, so single user, non-production use cases, I would, Andrew, not a lawyer, not an official representation, but it feels like we wouldn't be too angry with you about that. So, any updates or plans for supporting hierarchical namespaces? I don't know the answer to that. We can poke the PM team and see if they'll talk about that tomorrow. So I've heard some rumblings about it. I've seen some things talked about, but I don't know if there's any concrete plans with regard to it. Actually, that brings up a good point. I don't know how many people know this, but you can actually go to the Red Hat Jira. So if we go to, let me make sure I have the URL right. So it's issues.redhat.com.
Yep.
And you can go to browse projects here. And I'm not logged in at all. Oops, I hit the wrong button. Somehow I just logged in, and all I did was click the side button on my mouse by accident. What the heck just happened? So I'm logged in as my as my regular user account. So this is my developer account. So if we go to browse projects here, and you can see there's a whole list of projects kind of across Red Hat and various other things. You can do things like click on OpenShift container platform here in the left-hand menu, and it'll just be OpenShift related things. But for example, I can come in here and I can see, etcd, what's going on with etcd? And click on this Jira project. And after giving Jira a moment to think about it, there is a way to look in here and see like all of the stuff that's going on. Yes, okay, thank you, Jira. And see all of the stuff that's going on inside of here. You can tell I've never browsed to this site with this account. So you can get an idea of all the stuff that's happening across the various releases. Here's issues. So here's all of the etcd issues. Here, enhancement, IPI scale down support. And again, these are all public, so anybody can come and look. I don't know if you can make comments or not, but yeah, it's a great way to look and see what's coming in. Or get an idea of what's happening inside of OpenShift and various components of OpenShift. So I will point out that if you go back to that browse issues thing, let's see, nope. We'll go back to here. Sometimes I have learned over time that Jira search is a little strange. So if you use, for example, the OpenShift installer, so this project name, so cores, you can see the key here. So you can go to search and you can search for like cores, IBM Cloud IPI. And it'll search just within that particular project. And we can see here that IBM Cloud IPI is done. It was added in 4.10. So neat little trick if you're not familiar with it. So I think if you can make comments, I'm sure the PMs would love to hear. Like you can come down here and make comments and to say, hey, I'm customer such and such. If you're okay sharing that information, we would like to see this feature added.
Yeah, Tiger just called out that if the project is set to public, that you should be able to comment on it.
Okay. Yeah, I thought so, but I wasn't 100% sure. I know that and they've spent the last year and a half going through and making as many of these public as possible. And both the PMs in the field have been told, if there's private information, customer information, make sure you mark that comment or that issue as private. Otherwise, it's open by default, kind of like Bugzilla has been. Why can't a machine be part of two different machine config pools? So essentially because, and this is my understanding, because you would have a potential for conflict between the two pools. So pick a simple, silly file, right? The SSH host keys, or authorized keys rather. So if you have two machine pools and one of them are allowed access with Johnny's key and one of them is allowed access with my key, they'd basically bounce back and forth trying to replace that file. So the right way to do it is effectively to have one inherit from the other. So we see this fairly frequently with infrastructure nodes, right? Where infrastructure nodes, the machine config pool inherits from the worker machine config pool and then adds some additional configuration to it. And let me know if that didn't answer your question. And Johnny, you have anything to add there?
No, I think that's pretty accurate.
Okay. Let's see, two more things to go. So somebody asked in one of your internal mailing lists, hey, my customer is using IPI, but their DHCP server is a single point of failure. Does Red Hat have like a recommended or a set of guidelines for the DHCP server? So the answer to this is not really. And that's because there's lots of different DHCP servers and services available. So really the guidance or the request is make sure it's a highly available enterprise service. How you do that is going to depend on which DHCP server you're using. So if you're using, Windows for your DHCP server, they have a separate set of tooling that you can use. If you're using Quay, no, not Quay. What is the name of that thing? So the ISC DHCP server, which is kind of the most common one, but they also have Key. That's what it is. So Key is another one that you can use. And this one is, I've started experimenting with it. It's super easy. It's like JSON config. I don't know how many people use it in production or anything like that, but I thought it was interesting that the ISC folks have 2 DHCP servers. So yeah, it's just, if you use info blocks, if you use the regular ISC DHCP, which would be, I think what most rel based ones are going to be using, because you can just do a DNF install DHCPD and that's what you get. But yeah, it's just vendor independent. So that's why we don't really provide any specific guidance or anything like that. vGPU is supported by OpenShift virtualization based VMs from OpenShift 4.10. So it's in tech preview in 4.10, I should say. We should clarify. OpenShift virtualization helps with hierarchical namespaces for achieving multi-tenancy on GPUs through vGPUs. That's interesting. I don't know, but I do know who we can ask. And that would also be the PM team. Actually, that one I'll send to the engineering manager. So yeah, well, Srikanth, if you would like, please send me your question in email, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com, and I will ping the right people inside of Red Hat, and we'll get you a response to that question so that way we can find out. And I'll make sure for your other question about hierarchical namespaces, we'll get that one answered too, and I'll do my best to remember to post that into the chat tomorrow during the What's Next session. What's the difference between a machine set and a machine config pool, from Alan? So machine set is what defines a machine. So I happen to have a cluster here that we can look at this. So if I come down to compute and go to machine sets, so this is a AWS cluster, AWS IPI cluster. So we see we have 3 machine sets inside of my default deployment. And if I look inside of these, I can see things like in the spec here, it's going to say, what availability zone and region I want to use. As we come down here, what block devices to assign to it. So every time it creates a new AMI or a machine based off the AMI, it'll assign it a GP3 120 gigabyte disk. Here's the AMI ID to use, right? So on and so forth. Here's the subnet to connect it to. So this defines effectively the template whenever it needs to create a new machine to scale up the size of the cluster. So machine sets define the template. Machines are the actual provisioned node from those machine sets. So we were just looking at 2A. So if we look here, we have this US East 2A worker, and it should match what we saw inside of that machine set. A machine config pool, on the other hand, is a collection of machine configs. So we see here we have machine configs that go through, and here's the base level 00 worker. Here's worker container runtime. Here's worker kubelet. Here's the worker SSH config, so on and so forth. And so what the machine config pools do is they effectively collect the tags associated with a set of machine configs. They generate, and we see here this rendered master, rendered worker machine configs. They generate those rendered or end-to-end. They contain all of the like tagged ones or matching tagged ones. And then they apply that to a set of machines that match an equivalent tag, right? So if we look at our worker config pool here, we see in our spec here, right, here's name is rendered worker. We see all of the source machine configs that it's matching. So down here's the machine config selector. So anytime that the machine config has a label of machine configuration.OpenShift, role of worker, and anytime a node has a label of worker, it will apply these two things together. So that's the 3-minute version.
Yeah, this question gets asked quite a bit actually, because I think the machine config pool is like the one outlier that is just kind of like, it seems like it would be obvious because you see the pool and you're like, oh, it's just a pool of machine configs. But at the same time, you're kind of like, but what does it do? Why is it there? Why are we actually defining this thing?
Yeah. Yeah. And Alan, so is there any templates for bare metal? Is bare metal considered a provider? Yes, with a caveat. So long as you are doing bare metal IPI, it uses what's called metal cubed, which is a flavor of ironic in order to manage those machines. Do a quick search here for metal cubes, we end up at this page. So this is the upstream project for interacting with those. And effectively, we see here the bare metal operator and all of that. So if you follow the documentation, so we go to the docs and go down to 4.10, I go to the installing section as soon as I can find it. And we look for deploying installer provisioned clusters on bare metal. This kind of walks through all the steps, all of the config that you need in order to use metal cubes in order to deploy and manage those machines. And it connects over IPMI, or it'll use you can see the out-of-band management network here. It connects to those nodes, uses the standard mechanisms for doing hardware management, Redfish, so on and so forth, to do that. And if you want to set it up in a lab, there's actually a really cool project called Sushi that can do that. I'll have to dig up the link for that. All right. Real quick, the last of the top of mind topics. So if you didn't happen to notice, and I didn't see this before our stream last week, the Kubernetes folks published their changes in Kubernetes 1.24. So OpenShift kind of always keeping up with what's happening inside of Kubernetes, right? I don't know for sure if 4.11 will be 1.24 based, but I think it's, I would say it's a safe assumption. If it's not 4.11, it'll definitely be 4.12. So this is a good way. Remember back in the 4.9 timeframe, we were talking about how there was a number of APIs that were removed. How do I know about that ahead of time? How can I get as far ahead of that as possible? This is as far ahead as possible without going into GitHub and actually looking at the changes there. And so as we scroll down here, you see there's a whole section for API removal and deprecation. And so things like dynamic kubelet configuration, entry provisioner to CSI driver migration. So they're continuing the process of moving towards CSI and away from the entry stuff.
Master label.
Yeah, I thought this was an interesting one. I called this out to you the other day, Johnny. We are finally moving away. The whole gosh, what is that called now? The language initiative, friendly language, or non-obtrusive language. I can't remember the name of the project now, and this is really embarrassing. Anyway, so we're finally moving away from some of those long-term things. So you'll see the master label is no longer present, and it's instead moving to control plane. So if you happen to have any automation, that's going to be, that is triggered off of that particular label. So I'll say that custom machine config pools, for example, that are triggering off of that, just be aware that that is probably going to change at some point in the not too distant future and be using control plane instead. Let's see. So from Alan, so I can create the pool and select by node just to make sure I'm not crazy. We're all crazy. It's okay. Add a label to the node and select with my machine config pool. Yes. So one thing to be aware of is you generally don't want to have a small number of nodes, and by small number I mean especially one, in a machine config pool. And the reason for that is because if we come over here and look at our machine config pool, and I was already on it, wasn't I? So it's not in here, but we should be able to look at I'm going to see if I can cheat. Custom resource definitions, machine config pool. I want to do this because I want to use this thing over here. So if we look in the spec and we go to max unavailable, so it's not defined in most of the default machine config pools because the default is 1. But this is what controls the number of nodes that will be affected simultaneously by machine config pool actions. So for example, let's say that we update OpenShift, which results in a new version of CoreOS being pushed out to the nodes. This value would determine how many of those nodes are affected simultaneously. So by default, it's 1. So in my machine config pool of maybe I have 10 machines, it would go through them one at a time and do it. That may be slow, but it's reliable. You can bump that up. You can use either a number or so 2 or a percentage, 20%, and it'll affect it that way. And then it'll do 2 nodes at the same time, or however many you specify in there. So the reason why I say having a machine config pool with 1 node inside of it is a bad idea is because let's say that inside of my cluster, I have, right now I've got 3 worker nodes and I've got 3 machine config pools, 1 for each one of those worker nodes because I'm doing something special, configuring them uniquely each. Well, when I go to do a update of my cluster, what could happen is effectively all 3 of those machine config pools would say, I can take down up to one of my nodes. So I've got 1 node, I'm going to, do my thing with it. And now all 3 of my worker nodes just went down or just had some major action happen on side of them, which the only thing that would protect your application at that point is something like a pod disruption budget. So, right, you're not, instead of it making sure that there's at least 2 other nodes in the cluster that are still running or still capable of hosting application workload, that protection wouldn't be there. So it's one of those things I have always shied away from making those types of recommendations. If you need to do, usually when folks ask about having like a machine config pool per worker or per node, it's about like static IPs and stuff like that. I've always suggested that you should be doing that outside of the machine config paradigm. So whether that's at install time, so for example, using kernel parameters or booting to the live ISO and using nmcli, or using nmstate now with OpenShift 4.10 and bare metal. So Alan, I feel like you might be leaning that way. You just saved me. I was going to do that. So if you're using bare metal, whether it's bare metal IPI or bare metal UPI, if you're installing to physical servers, nmstate is supported with OpenShift 4.10. So nmstate, and we talked about this a few streams ago. I'll see if we can find a link.
Yeah, I get it.
Okay, thank you. But nmstate effectively gives you a Kubernetes native way of managing the network configuration of those hosts. So you can do things like go in and set static IPs on secondary and tertiary interfaces and adjust routes if you need to. All the other networking stuff that you would normally do. All right. Thank you, Johnny.
Yep, no problem.
And I just realized I don't even have our stream up. And so I've got the interface here, but normally I have like Twitter or a Twitch rather up.
And it's a compassionate language project. So thank you, Chandler.
Yeah, thank you. There we go. So I just posted that link that Johnny found for the nmstate live stream into Twitch. Should get rebroadcast across the others. All right, and thank you, Stephanie, also for publishing that. Okay, so let's talk about today's topic. So again, we talked about this at the start of best practices are not required. They're not even recommended in every situation. We should still take a critical eye and we should evaluate whether or not best practices should be applied to each one of our scenarios. When I was a storage admin, when I worked for a storage vendor, we always used to talk to folks about performance, right? And it was, what's the best practices for configuring, my storage with VMware or something like that. And, here's 20 things that we see commonly done. But the recommendation was always do these one at a time and test before and after to make sure it has the intended effect, because it might not. It might be detrimental because your workload is different. Your, storage access pattern because of your applications is doing something. So much like that, I think everything that we'll talk about today is always or should always be individually considered. But it is very common things that we see applied that we, both Johnny and I individually, me and the, I've been in the BU for the last 3 years. Johnny was a consultant for a long time, so saw a lot of what customers are doing. And remember, every one of these things is stuff that we solicited or we got back as responses from our field folks saying, yeah, we see our customers doing this. We encourage our customers to do this in a lot of cases. So, all right. Any favorite ones you want to start off with, Johnny?
Do we just want to go with the number one, or do we want to start with like the number 10?
Yeah, I did mention that, didn't I? We should do like a David Letterman top 10 type of thing. But no, I think we can either go. We don't have to go linearly, but we can jump around a little bit. Yeah, so let's start with the suggestions up here. So from an architecture perspective, I think there's a couple of important things that were brought up. One, it was recommended by several folks not to use stretched clusters. So that's something that we have talked about here on the stream several times before. Of stretched clusters, logically, a lot of people like that concept or that idea, right? I have multiple data centers, even if all of the latency and throughput requirements are met for OpenShift and for etcd, it makes sense of I can lose an entire data center, and that entire data center can, if I lose it because I still have resources in other data centers, then I can I keep functioning. I keep being able to utilize my my cluster. Sorry, I'm multitasking. That's why I'm talking intermittently. Multitasking, trying to bring up the link here. So Red Hat published this KCS. You can see it's updated regularly and frequently to cover recommendations around spanning clusters across multiple sites. So inside of here, it doesn't actually say don't do this. I would say it recommends against it, but it's still a supported configuration. You technically can do it. So why do we suggest not doing this? Why do we recommend against it? And in my opinion, and I think many other folks' opinion, it's because of the increased complexity. So we think we're protecting ourselves from data center failure, right? If all of if my whole cluster is in one data center, that data center fails, now I've lost, my whole application is down. Whereas if it's a spread across, 3 data centers, then I can lose one and everything continues to function. But the problem is there's a lot of complexity that comes in when now I have to figure out, how to keep the networking, at a minimum, probably a CAN, if not the WAN, working across all 3 sites. If I encounter, latency spikes or storage issues at one site or any number of other things, suddenly I end up in the scenario where it's not one big event that affects my uptime. It's 1,000 little events. I lost 5 minutes here. I lost 2 minutes there. I had this spike in capability or latency here and stuff like that. I long time ago worked on a military base. We literally had a tank run over the pipeline that the fiber was running through and squished the whole thing. And it's otherwise it was perfectly fine, right? The other data center was like a kilometer away. And, it's things like that you can't predict. So while there's nothing inherently wrong with it and it's not unsupported, it's just not. It often doesn't achieve the results that you want. So I'll pause there. Johnny, thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think like the more layers you add to something that's already complex, it gets further and further away from you, and then trying to debug something that's going wrong, it makes it harder and it takes longer to figure it out. Where if you had a little bit more isolation, it kind of narrows the scope a little.
Yep, I agree. So again, if that is something you're interested in, stretch clusters, just carefully evaluate what your end goal is, what you're trying to protect against, and if there are other better ways. I say better strangely because I'm thinking it's subjective, right? Better is subjective.
Hmm.
Usually our most frequent recommendation is multiple clusters and using something like GitOps or Ansible or ACM or whatever your tool of choice happens to be to replicate or duplicate that application functionality.
Yeah, and it really just determine like the level of availability that you have to have for that application, right? And then, really you have to go from there. That's your starting point, and then work backwards from there and figure out like how to get storage and everything replicated. So
Yeah.
it's a hard problem to solve.
So another one that I thought was interesting, and another one that we have talked about here on the stream before, is doing backups of etcd. So this is something that we hear kind of both ways on frequently of, oh yeah, we always take backups of etcd, or we never take backups of etcd. I fall into the camp of you should have them, but be aware of their best use case. So if you are wanting to fully recover a completely lost cluster using an etcd backup, that's not the ideal use case. You're probably going to have a bad time. If if your cluster is very large, think, dozens of nodes, thousands of pods, or hundreds of nodes and tens of thousands of pods. If your etcd database ends up being very large, having a backup of that can make recovering from a etcd node failure dramatically easier. So a couple of weeks ago, we showed how to do that, etcd recovery, despite me borking the DHCP portion of it. And I think I mentioned during that time of if I had an etcd backup, I could restore that backup to that new node, and then the existing other nodes would only have to resync data that's changed after that backup was taken. So if my etcd database ends up being, multiple gigabytes in size, then replicating all of that data to a new node can tax what might be an already, strained storage subsystem or network subsystem trying to do that. So etcd backups are useful for recovering individual nodes. You can even recover like two nodes. But if it's a full cluster loss, then I would say you're better off creating a whole new cluster and then recovering the workload on top of that cluster. So, redeploying the applications, reintroducing the PVs, PVCs, all that other stuff. And for our audience, please don't hesitate to weigh in on any of these. I'm interested to hear your experiences and see if you have any thoughts or things that maybe contradict or maybe concur with what we've seen and what we're saying.
Yeah, and just to kind of like go in a little bit on that too, like make sure that you're backing up your configs. So if you're creating YAML by hand, right, for your PV or whatever, keep that stored somewhere. Put it in Git. Preferably put everything that you can in Git, and then that way you can have some level of automation getting it back. Maybe write some playbooks or using GitOps.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept, Johnny. Have you ever seen folks doing that? Not doing GitOps, but using Git to track like the configuration. Hey, when we last deployed it, it looked like this.
Yep, that's exactly what they'll do. Is they'll essentially do like a OC Git -o YAML, dump it down to a file, and then take out all of the metadata stuff, and then just essentially pump that right back into Git, and then pull it, and then OC apply -f on the directory.
Yeah, that logically that makes sense to me. It seems like an easy way to protect that information
Hmm.
without having to necessarily go, where's Christian when I need him, without having to make the leap all the way into the GitOps philosophy.
Yeah, it's because GitOps is it's not new, but it's newer, and I think that like people are still there's still a lot of people trying to get on the DevOps train, and trying to get like that whole wagon moving the right way, and
Yeah,
now there's GitOps, so I think that this is kind of like that nice little intermediary, because at the end of the day, right, you just need to have a backup, or I don't want to say a backup, but you need to have a copy of it somewhere, so that way you can restore from at least a known good source instead of trying to hand jam it out from memory. And
yeah.
if you're me, it's gonna be terrible.
Yeah, GitOps, I will fully admit, and Christian makes fun of me all the time for this, like Git is intimidating. Like
Indeed.
I always make fun of Christian, and I tell him Git is what happens when engineers just run amok, right? When they have no product manager or anything like that to say, should we really be doing that? That seems like a bad idea. And there's like 9,000 subcommands and options and all this other stuff. The last time I developed anything, wrote any code, like SVN was state of the art. So just instead of having to go through this process of adopting GitOps and having to figure out how to do pull requests and reviews and doing cherry picking and like all of this other stuff that is it's intimidating for especially for us administrators, or me I should say. I don't know about everybody else. It can be a gentler slope, if you will.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And outside of like a normal Git workflow, like the Git add commit push type thing, like it could be black magic to a lot of people. And then like even where I feel like I'm decently I'm decent at Git, like I'm still constantly asking all the time for help. There's just so much to it.
Yeah.
And Chandler made a good point about customize. Like customize is another great way because it's very similar to just what we're talking about, right? You can have just a customization file with your changes and then apply that. Yeah, so that's a good call as well.
Yeah. So I see there, Chandler, no, Srikanth, the idea of developer control planes. So it's interesting you bring that up. I recently saw a presentation about a thing called KCP. So let me bring up the GitHub here. So KCP is, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe what it does. It abstracts the Kubernetes cluster and the Kubernetes API from, or let me think, let me rephrase that. The Kubernetes API and the Kubernetes workload from the underlying Kubernetes cluster. So basically, I create a workspace in KCP, and it is a Kubernetes API endpoint that I, as the user, have full control over. I can do things like deploy my own, operators, my own CRDs inside of there, and all this other stuff. And it offers that ability to basically give each one of those developers or developer teams their own control plane to do what they need with it. So I thought this was super cool. It's like a super early, engineering folks inside of Red Hat are experimenting with it, playing with it. I thought it was a really cool presentation and to see what's happening there. So did we post that into, let me post it here so that way I can send that out. So it's just something to keep an eye on, right? Nothing anytime soon that I would expect to see from Red Hat or from OpenShift on that. But if that's something that's interesting to you, Srikanth, keep an eye on that. I don't have experience, but I strongly recommend against a total control plane loss. Yes, wholeheartedly agree. R-Hope9. ASD, I want to be a Red Hat engineer. Phenomenal. I highly encourage anybody and everyone who is interested in joining Red Hat. We don't have like an internal, external jobs portal. Everything is on like jobs.redhat.com.
Yep, I posted the link.
Careers.redhat.com, maybe.
Jobs.redhat.com.
Oh, there we go. So, yeah, you can tell I haven't been to this site in a while. I'm happy with what I'm doing. So, I encourage everybody, if you're interested, come here, look for any roles that are interesting to you. If you have any questions about like roles, like what does this mean? Like, maybe what does this role actually entail or something like that, you're welcome to reach out to us. John and I are happy to explain terminology and stuff like that to you. We don't mind at all.
Yep.
You can use GitOps in reverse, where you test changes to see the outcome, then update Git as collective memory for recovery purposes. Yes, absolutely. That's what I used to do way back when I was a junior vSphere administrator. We would create PowerShell to do what we, to make it look like how we wanted, and then basically implement it, and then take that PowerShell script and put it into an SVN repository. Let's see, working down our list here. So one of the ones that I thought was super interesting that actually came up, I think 4 or 5 times as well from different folks, is the concept of onboarding. And it's not like an action that we take as administrators, right? It's not a apply this YAML and do this thing. It's rather, helping our developer friends and application teams understand, hey, you're using Kubernetes. Like, do you know what that means? Do you know how to effectively use the features and functions of Kubernetes? And I tried to find and tried to see if there was some collateral inside of Red Hat that we could share of, like, hey, here's 10 things that you should show your a simple 10 slide presentation that you should show your developers to help them understand things like um, quotas, right? And we'll talk more about those in a minute, right? Requests and limits for pods and all of this other stuff. So that way, we can or we don't accidentally paint ourselves in a corner through inadvertent misconfiguration, if you will, at the application level.
Yeah, I actually had a customer that they were onboarding like a big monolithic application. They were just trying to get it into OpenShift, and they ended up essentially like taking this entire application, all 32 gigs of RAM and 8 CPUs and everything, and just plugging it in. And then they're running like it was insane the way that they were doing this. But yeah, it's essentially 316 gig and 4 CPU nodes just ate it right away. Like they took the cluster down in like 35 minutes.
Yeah,
Pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those. And here one of the examples that somebody sent us. If you have a cluster, but users don't understand how to use requests, limits, probes for readiness, liveness, pod disruption budgets, replicas more than one, and so on and so forth. Effectively, as an administrator, you're now limited because let's say that they created just a standalone pod deployment, and there's no scale, there's nothing that recovers that per se if something changes. Hey, I need to do an OpenShift update, and it does a coordinate drain of the node, and that pod might not come back. Right? We want to use things like deployments and replica sets to ensure that there is always a minimum number running, and that number should be greater than one in many cases. So having that onboarding process, having just a basic Kubernetes 101 course for maybe developers, application teams who are new to Kubernetes, is something that I could definitely see is very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
Tiger, join us and might take you axe throwing. Yeah. So for anybody who doesn't know, Tiger was our intern back in 2019 before the pandemic and all that happened. And one of the team building exercises that we did was to go axe throwing here in downtown Raleigh. I'm terrible at it. As you can tell, I'm super athletic, right? That's my thing. So I was terrible at it, but we had a lot of fun doing it. I was very surprised that the axe throwing place served alcohol. That seemed like a huge liability to me, but yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
who am I?
RHOPE 9 SVN is a slightly better RCS. Yeah, that seems accurate. The team disassembled. We grew quite substantially, actually. I think we were 8 or 9 at that time, and now the team is 25 or so. So, good times. Back in the before times, right, when we all got out of the house more often than
Back in my day.
my wife was making fun of me because we went to Costco this past week, and I was like, I don't think I've left the house for more than like walking the dogs in the last week or maybe even 2. Yeah,
struggle is real, man. The struggle is real.
Yeah. So continuing on with our previous onboarding thought process, let's expand on that a little bit. Of what are some things that we think most, if not all, applications should be using, right? And our pod definitions, our deployment definitions, whatever it happens to be that we're using for our applications. So the 2 that came up most frequently were requests and limits. But there was some controversy here, right? So a request is tantamount to a reservation from the scheduler's perspective. So it doesn't actually reserve those resources on the host. It just sets them, it reserves them from the scheduler so let's say I have a node with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and I create a pod with a request for 4 gigabytes of memory. So the scheduler will say 4 gigabytes of memory on this node are consumed, even if that pod is only using 128 megabytes. And we see this fairly often where I'll have a node that is, it's out of capacity, right? I can't schedule to it because it's out of capacity. And when you look at it in, the metrics or something like that, so we can actually look at this. So if I go here to the dashboards and I look at, for example, my nodes, I think I want this guy. Right. So here, my CPU usage is at like 2, right? My CPU quota down here is all very low. My memory usage is all, relatively low. But if I switch over to the CLI and I do like an OC describe node, this is a worker node. We'll go with that guy. Down here at the bottom, I've got this requests and limits. So you can see that even if nothing is going on this host, 25%, 24% of the memory is set aside and can't be allocated. So we'll see this where a node is at 98% or 95% memory requests, even though actual node utilization. So if I do an OC ADM top nodes, we can see here actual memory utilization on this 151.217 is only at 21%. CPU is at 5%, even though 36% of the CPU is tied up in those requests. So we have to strike this balance. So the feedback we got from the field was, well, we strongly encourage everyone to use limits and requests. And then we got some more feedback, and it was limits are great, or limits are great, requests are sometimes okay. And then we got some more, and it was requests are great, but limits are terrifying. And it was a lot of mixed feedback. And the reason for that is because, well, it can have different effects on different applications. So, for example, let's say that I'm running a Java application, and my Java virtual machine, right? I set a minimum memory of 512 megabytes of RAM and a max of 2 gigabytes. In that instance, it probably makes sense to set both a request and a limit to, those values plus or minus some percentage, for various other things that are happening. Because if it's going over that limit, there's probably something wrong, right? There's something unexpected is happening or something that we don't want is happening inside of there. But other times, and I'm thinking about you, Python, where suddenly I'll the developer does something crazy, they made a mistake or something happened, and we just loaded like a 30 gigabyte object into memory, right? We unpacked this massive array or something like that, or this JSON object came back and it was 600,000 lines instead of 6, something like that. So that is also unexpected behavior. And if it unexpectedly consumes dramatically more memory or CPU than it should, do we want to limit that? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And what I mean by that is, again, picking on Java, if I limit the CPU, so I put in a limit that says you cannot consume any more than one CPU, 1000 millicores. But it's a very large Java application. And if you don't know, when Java first starts up, it loads all of the classes and all the other stuff that it needs, and it consumes a lot of CPU up front. And maybe it's with unlimited CPU, it takes this long, but with one CPU, it takes this long. But there's a threshold. Eventually, it'll fail. It'll say, I can't complete this task, and it'll terminate the process. It'll just fail to load. So now I'm at this point where, because I limited it, my application can no longer start. So it's one of those, like, as a developer, as an app team, as an administrator, we have to be aware of, and we have to work with each other to understand what those requirements are. So we can't really make blanket statements around use requests and limits, because sometimes they're not good. Sometimes they're great. Just a great link to have bookmarked when you need to troubleshoot an OpenShift 4 issue. I have a feeling, or hope 9, that this is the generic troubleshooting. Yep. Consolidated troubleshooting article for OpenShift. Yep. That's a great one. So if the link that Our Hope 9 just posted in there is one that they took a bunch of KCS articles all related to troubleshooting things in OpenShift and put them into one, so you can kind of link out from there. So definitely bookmark that one if you don't already. So for all of those same reasons, limit ranges were just as controversial, right? Because so if you don't know, a limit range will set a default as well as a minimum and maximum, request and limit for your pods. So even if the developer doesn't know or doesn't take the time to set a limit, the limit range will automatically enforce it inside of there. So where I'm building with all of this is, I think, Andrew's opinion is quotas are the real hero here, because I can set a per namespace quota, and then my application team, if they make a mistake or if they do something like that, they're only affecting their other application components. They don't have they probably won't affect the entire rest of the cluster or a lot of other services that are running inside of there. So it was something that came up again from multiple people when we asked the question of, use quotas, implement quotas from day one. You can, and I think we showed in one of the early streams, I'll have to dig up the link and put it in a blog post. You can set a default quota that is automatically applied using the template, new project template.
Project template. Yep.
Yep. And do I have the docs up anywhere here? I do. So if we look for a new project template, and if we go to this configuring project creation, I'll post this into Twitch here. So this effectively is a template, not an OpenShift template, but a template in the traditional sense. A template for what happens when we create a new project, OC new project. And you can add in any number of objects for it to create inside of here, including quota objects that get applied to every single namespace when it gets created. There are some secondary issues that occur there. Technically, depending on the permissions that the user has in the namespace, they could delete or modify their quota. I think the community of practice has an operator for that, where they enforce quotas, and you tell the operator what you want the quota to be, and it makes sure that even if it gets changed, it gets reverted to what you want it to be. But yeah, that's one way that you can do something like that for mandating quotas inside of your projects.
Yeah, this is the approach that we've taken with pretty much, I don't want to say every single customer, but like when you talk about having a customer with multiple users, right, it plays into the multi-tenancy. So it's like, go ahead and create this new project template. That way you can come up with some sane defaults. Start there, that's your baseline, and then you work your way up. But going back to like the limits and ranges and limit ranges and all that, right? It's a fluid discussion, between the admin and the end user, and then that way you can work together to tune it and get it to where it's just right. But it's okay to come up with base defaults with the new project template and then build up from there.
Yeah, and in my opinion, it leads into and I don't think I actually put this one in our notes document, Johnny. So surprise. I think one of the other critical components of this is monitoring. Okay, having we do have an item here to talk about monitoring or alerting rather in just a moment, but having the monitoring in place so that when these things happen, so that you can take action, whether that action is, hey, we really do need to increase the size, the resources in the cluster, or I need to go and have a conversation with this team and figure out what's going on over there. Like, why do they keep doing thing X, whatever it happens to be? One of my favorite stories was we had when I was a storage admin, we had a developer who made a mistake, and they created an infinite loop, and they were trying to read from a file using Perl, and it errored out, and it just went into an infinite loop of error, and they ended up creating it's like a 10 or 12 terabyte text file that was just the same, like 4 words over and over and over and over again.
All work and no
And,
play.
I get a call and it's like 1 a.m. because throughout the day the file system had been filling up, and the help desk, they finally saw it on the monitor, and they're like, this thing is at like 88% full. What do we do? Well, does it look like it's going to stop? well, it's been building since about 7 o'clock, and it's, it was at 60% then. Okay. And we ended up having to, we expanded. It was a NetApp. We expanded the aggregate to add more capacity to keep the whole thing from going offline. And then we basically had to use various tools to figure out what the process was and kill it.
That's awesome. Perl.
Christian, anytime someone mentions GitOps anywhere, I'm notified. Yeah.
Play Beetlejuice.
But it was nothing but good things, I promise. We love GitOps, Christian. Let's see, a couple of questions here. Divya, please let me know the difference between a Bastion node and service layer NAT gateway. I'm not sure what service layer NAT gateway would be referring to. Johnny, do you have any thoughts on that?
The only thing I can think of is like the NAT gateway in AWS. Okay. I'm not sure if that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, if you can clarify what you mean by service layer NAT gateway. So Bastion node is usually like literally a node that exists inside of that environment. So if we're talking AWS, it would be inside of that. What's the name for a network? VPC. So it's a node that is inside of that VPC that we can connect to as an administrator or user, and then access other resources inside of that VPC. What would you recommend scheduler be set to, pack wide or high? So this is a hard one, right? And it's again one of those, it always depends. So virtualization, we always think go wide, right? We want to distribute virtual machines across all of the nodes, so that way if any one node fails, it doesn't take down an unusual amount of resources. I think Kubernetes, by and large, we probably think the same. Where I want to evenly distribute my workload across all of my nodes, so that way I'm not I don't end up in a scenario where the failure of one node results in a lot of extra work or impact. And also it gives you some more flexibility with, hey, this pod on node 7, which is only 30% utilized, it has a lot more headroom before, it needs to burst up in CPU or memory utilization, something like that. So using the, high node utilization, I think, is the scheduler profile. We can look. Scheduler profile. If we look at the scheduler profiles, which is effectively what I think we're talking about here. So low node utilization does its best to spread pods evenly across nodes. High node utilization places as many pods as possible onto as few nodes as possible. My opinion is this is really useful when we're in a hyperscaler. Because in a hyperscaler, I pay for 100% of that instance, its CPUs, its memory, whether I'm using 1% of it or 100% of it. So if I can drive utilization of the individual nodes as high as possible and prevent additional, AMIs or AWS, Azure, Google, whatever instances from being provisioned, I am, in theory, saving my company money. And then I can rely on things like cluster autoscaling to add more resources when it's necessary. Namespace operator. Oh yeah, thank you, Johnny.
Yep, no problem.
We'll post that link in just a moment. So Johnny dug up the I mentioned before the community of practice for the Red Hat field folks. They have this namespace configuration operator, which, among other things, will do quota enforcement. There's another question up here.
Yeah, Alan asked about the is the ingress controller in charge of the upload speeds, or basically like what's managing the keep alive D and HA proxy?
That is the ingress controller. I don't know if we have exposed some of the advanced functionality. The functionality that we used to expose or allow people to modify in OpenShift 3. I don't know if it's exposed through the operator yet.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
Let's rephrase that. So the ingress controller manages the ingress HA proxy. So if you're referring to keep alive D, it depends on which keep alive D we're talking about here. So with an IPI, on-prem IPI deployment, the API and ingress virtual IP addresses are managed by separate keep alive D instances. Their config is actually controlled through machine config. And if we look at github.com/OpenShift/machine, well, I'm not going to remember what it is, so we'll search for it. Machine config. So if we look for machine config operator here, and then we can see specifically what it's going to use here. If we go to templates and then common and on-prem and files, and we have this keep alive D. So this is where we can see the keep alive D config for those API and ingress VIPs. So they're controlled separately. There is also two other concepts. So one is the keep alive D operator from the COP. So it very similar functionality, very similar thing, right? It uses keep alive D to manage what is effectively a ingress IP. So if we come back over here to our docs for ingress IP. Yep. So ingress IP with an external IP. So effectively, that keep alive D operator from the COP manages this external IP that we're associating with a service. So we can have that ingress IP functionality. So kind of different functionalities, different ways to control those things depending on what specifically you're doing inside of there. Let's see. I'm working my way up questions here.
Yep, Katesh is asking, so he's having some deployment issues. Essentially, the first control plane node is coming up and getting its config. Looks like it's setting correctly, and then his second and third control plane nodes are essentially, config not found, no host name getting set, etc.
I would be curious what deployment type. So UPI, IPI, non-integrated.
UPI vSphere.
Yeah. Okay. UPI vSphere. Are they all on the same subnet? All connected to the same network? Like, is there a firewall or something like that between them, or some other network configuration? So behind the scenes, what happens is the Bootstrap node comes up. It starts a proto control plane, and most importantly for the next step, a single node etcd instance and the machine config server. And then the control plane nodes come up and they look to that machine config server to get their configuration. And that includes, here's all the pods that you need to start. Here's, how to start the etcd operator. And when it all works according to plan, effectively the Bootstrap hands over etcd and the control plane functions to the new control plane. And then the new control plane takes over. So it sounds like it may be, for whatever reason, there's a network communication error, maybe a network config error. So network config, checked if you're using static IPs, check to make sure that things like subnet masks, gateways are set correctly. Make sure there's no IP conflict. I've done that myself in my lab. I don't know how many times. Oh yeah, it doesn't ping. It must be available. No, it's not. Let's see, network communication, usually it's things like firewalls that get in the way or misconfigured routers. But yeah, Johnny's suggestion there of checking the logs on the Bootstrap node. So you can SSH to Bootstrap. It's SSH core at the Bootstrap IP address using the SSH private key that maps to the public key you provided in install config.yaml. That was hard to say. Once you get there, the message of the day that prints when you log in has a journal control command that you can use to see the bootkube logs, and that'll tell you what's going on behind the scenes. Let's see, chat jumping around on me.
Yeah, so one of them was, let's see, I'm going to kill this username. I will kick a 67. He said they recently, my goodness, they over provision their nodes a lot and they see probe issues when things get near max CPU on nodes. Are there any suggestions on that front? They have to set their kubelet to reserved, but he thinks that because they're over provisioning those settings that basically there's nothing really in place to protect them.
Yeah, that would be expected, I think. So when you're saying over provision, are you over provisioning pods on your Kubernetes nodes, on your OpenShift nodes, or OpenShift nodes on your hypervisor nodes? I think it's probably the former, judging by how you describe that. So yeah, one of the things that you can optionally take there, and we talked about this, is, gosh, where's that going to be documented at? I think it's under nodes. I'm looking for the documentation on how to have it auto-configure the system reserved memory and CPU. So yeah, I'll see if we can dig that up. We did talk about it on the stream before. I'll have to see if I can find where we talked about it on the stream. That might be one option to maybe eliminate that or alleviate that. But ultimately, if there's a lot of, especially CPU contention, like, yeah, it's there's not a lot you can do in that respect. To have it, for example, prioritize liveness and readiness probes or something like that. Instead, you'll just have to rely on the system to do things like evict nodes that are over-consuming resources, or evict pods rather, and let them be rescheduled. But yeah, over provisioning is great, or over, sometimes we call it over commitment, or over subscription, right? So the concept there is I have 4 CPUs on my node, and maybe I'm not setting a request. Remember, a request is like a reservation, and my pods are using less than 4 CPUs of resources, but maybe they have limits that are at, when I total them together, they're 12 CPUs or 24 CPUs or whatever it happens to be. So there exists this possibility that the pods, the workload can consume all of the CPU resources on the node. So yeah, it aside from protecting kubelets resources and some of the other things, the workload is usually left to its own without that. Even with a request, it's not a reservation. So if some other pod is running and over consuming resources, it would just be a lower priority and therefore be evicted before those that have a request and a limit set. There's a very roundabout way of saying, unfortunately, no.
We got there.
Yeah. Lewis, when clusters become large, many pods and namespaces, tasks that were previously simple and easy begin to get complicated, such as updates. Yes. So that was something that we, one of the other things that we had come in, which was an opinion, because I also asked our field folks for controversial opinions. So an opinion that we are seeing an uptick in the number of folks who are using smaller, more purpose-driven clusters as opposed to very large multi-purpose clusters. And it's for that very reason. It can be complicated from a management perspective. I need to have, dozens of machine configs that all need to be updated and managed and revision controlled and all that other stuff, because I've got, maybe 5 or 6 different node types, and they each need different configurations applied, a GPU node and a network optimized node and high memory nodes and storage, nodes that have ultra fast, resources. And, it can get complicated very quickly. So the best that I can offer there is, anecdotally, and we heard this from Tushar Katarki when he was on the stream, we're seeing customers move towards a larger number of smaller clusters. The good news is, I guess, twofold. So one, you aren't penalized from that, from a entitlement perspective, right? Control plane nodes, infrastructure nodes there's no entitlements associated with them. You do, if you're using AWS or Azure or something like that, you would have to, pay for those additional resources used, but so there is some good news there. The other side being ACM is getting better and better and more scalable. I think they're up to like 2,000 clusters or something now that they can manage. So ACM can help make that manageability with many smaller clusters easier. Johnny, anything to add there?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that with now the capability of having like the smaller flavors of clusters too, right, where you don't necessarily have to have a 3 control plane, n number of worker nodes, right? We can have the compact cluster of 3 nodes, or we can have a single node OpenShift, that type of thing. I think with that coming out, and then those services just getting better and better, that it makes more sense to maybe just do it that way rather, and deploy like super small, and then that way you're only really using up, your cloud costs.
Yeah. I'm scrolling up through chat here. Gitesh, please do. You can ping us on Twitter, on Reddit, on email, andrew.sullivan@redhat.com. Whichever works best for you. We used to set them manually before the script existed and haven't switched. Yeah, that was for the system reserved resources. Yeah, the script, and I need to dig up where we talked about it in the stream, because in the stream I walked through like how it determines the resources that it's going to set, which is in line, if I remember correctly, with Google's upstream documentation as well. Yep. Thank you, Stephanie, for posting my email address there. All right. So let's in the interest of time, let's dig through a couple of these. Let's see. So we talked about limit ranges, limits requests. We talked about pod disruption budgets briefly. So I'll reiterate and drive home the point of pod disruption budgets are important, because it communicates to the scheduler how many of those applications pods can be affected by anything and everything at any point in time. So whether it's doing something like rolling out a new deployment or a new version of the deployment, whether it's coordinate draining nodes for an update process, or maybe it's a lost node, it uses that pod disruption budget to help prioritize when pods are restored, help determine when we can't do maintenance operations on nodes and stuff like that. I always encourage folks to use pod disruption budgets, but again, sometimes we have to work with our application peers, because if they set them incorrectly, we can end up in a scenario where we can't do maintenance activities. So, for example, I have 3 worker nodes, and they set a deployment with 3 replicas and a pod disruption budget of 0, right? Where it's all 3 of them must always be running all of the time. Well, now I can't really do node maintenance operations, right? Because if I do maintenance on my node, then I might end up in a scenario where I have to coordinate drain it, where not all of those are going to be available, and that will cause the rollout or the updates to fail, right? They'll pause and they'll wait. So, Stephanie, I see your chat here on the back end. I don't know, for our audience, if anybody's having issues with hearing us or seeing us, just let us know. But I think everything's okay. It looks fine from what I've been able to see. But yeah, just let us know.
Same for me. I was able to see it on YouTube and on Twitch.
Yep. Let's see. So some cluster configuration things that that folks were suggesting to us. Create and use an admin account other than kubeadmin. This is that's a good one. So there's 2 aspects to that. So one, kubeadmin, it's useful in some scenarios, especially if like your certificates expire and you can't bring up the the ingress controller or something like that. The installer generates that kubeadmin file. So if I switch back over to my screen here, let's see, I want to share this window. So if we look inside of here, see clusters. So this is the directory where I deployed my cluster from. If we look in the auth directory, right, we have this kube config, and I can use that to connect as kubeadmin. See, who am I? Because that's what I'm using now. I can connect with that user at any time, but we probably want to rotate the password at a minimum, which we showed a couple of weeks ago. I'll include a link to that post from Andy Block. And you can regenerate this kubeadmin's certificate, the certificate-based login that it uses. You can also create certificate-based logins, just like this one works, for other things, for other users. So I can create an Andrew user or a Johnny user, and just like that that kube config. So we see we have this big set of certificate data and all that other stuff in there. And yes, I'm okay showing this because this cluster gets destroyed immediately after the stream ends. So, it enables that authentication that sort of bypasses the traditional methods, right? So there's no, if you've configured LDAP authentication or something like that, it's a direct certificate authentication, which can be helpful. But we should still protect that account. We should definitely consider not using kubeadmin because it's well known, and instead creating a Johnny admin and giving them the same certificate-based login.
But just make sure that before you blow away kubeadmin, you actually have another cluster admin, because you do not want to be.
I've done that to myself before, not with Kubernetes, with vCenter. Yeah. Actually, I think when you and I worked together, you might have been the one who saved me.
It's very possible.
Hey, can you? I accidentally removed myself as admin. Can you add me back in?
Oh yeah, very likely that happened. Yes.
Yeah. I see. Moving down our list here, setting up time synchronization. Yeah, that one is very important for a number of different reasons. One, if it's off too far during cluster setup, it'll cause the nodes to fail to configure. Basically, it usually shows up as a certificate error, right? Saying the certificate is invalid because it's too old or too new. Those are always fun. This certificate is from the future.
Yes.
So yeah, time synchronization is important both at cluster setup as well as going forward. Old school basic admin principles, things like logging. If your time is off on your nodes, then your aggregated logs are going to have weird out of sync timestamps, and that makes troubleshooting and problem resolution really hard. Waleed, need to check. Blah, 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 not setting limits, just set a resource request, but no limits, as apparently is cause of many side issues. Yep. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, Hillary. Yeah, so, and for anybody who doesn't know, Hillary is the new co-host of the GitOps Guide to the Galaxy, Christian's stream. So that's a good one. I'll look at that right after our stream ends here, Waleed. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've got it linked up over here so that way I can check it out.
Yeah, same. Moving down the list, object pruning. So let me copy my already existing link to the documentation. Object pruning is or comes in two flavors, if you will. So one is pruning the registry. And that's normally what we think of when we think of when we hear the word pruning and containers together. Pruning the registry, removing no longer used image layers and stuff like that, which is definitely important. But when we're talking about pruning in OpenShift and with the nodes, what we're talking about is cleaning up unused objects and unused things on the hosts as well. So just like with the registry, we can end up with unused layers. Over time, our nodes end up with, container images that are no longer used, right? New versions have been deployed. Layers are now obsolete or orphaned. Empty dir, directories that are no longer in use. Lots of other cruft that builds up. So you don't have to configure it to happen at periodic intervals. It'll basically happen automatically when the node reaches a certain threshold. I think it's 85%. It'll automatically trigger a pruning, garbage collection type of action. And I think this is what I'm looking for here. No, that's deployments. Anyways, so it will occur at the host level once it reaches a certain point. But there are other things, and we can see, so deployment resources, builds, cron jobs, right? All of these other things, which just create clutter inside of our objects. So there probably won't be. So, but if I do OC get cron job -a and OC get job -a, I can end up in a scenario where, maybe I created a job and it spun up 1,000 pods, and that job is just sitting here, not doing anything, or OC get pod -a. So you can see I've got all of these completed pods in here, and they will periodically get cleaned up automatically. But if I've got a high rate of churn, right, again, I've got a cron job or a job that creates a whole bunch of pods or something like that, maybe I want to configure something to go in here and clean up this stuff. It's just etcd hygiene, right, that type of stuff inside the cluster. And as of, I think it's 4.8, Johnny, etcd will automatically do compaction as well. So that whole, what we were talking about before with etcd backups, if it gets really big and I have a failure and now I have to replicate a bunch of data, and if a lot of that data is just old junk that we don't need anymore, it has a ripple effect. So just hygiene type stuff.
Yep, exactly. And the other thing to consider about jobs is that without cleaning them up, you can't rerun the same job, right? You have to go and destroy it. And so if you're not aware of that, then you could be debugging why this thing isn't working. So
yeah. Oh yeah, that's a good reminder. Let's see. So I've only got I think two more. So in the interest of time, since we're approaching 12:30, we'll cover these last two. For anybody out in the audience, any questions, anything that you want us to address, go ahead and send those over now. We'll do our best to answer all of those questions here before we end the stream. Anything that we don't get to, please feel free to send us a message. So whether it's social media, Twitter, I'm at Practical Andrew, Johnny is at JRockTX1. Email andrew.sullivan@redhat.com or Johnny, JONNY, at redhat.com. We'll cover all of that again in a few minutes when we get to the end of the stream. But yeah, go ahead and submit those over while we cover these last few items. All right, the penultimate of our list here, Alertmanager. This is one that I love because honestly, I run a lab, right? My clusters very rarely run for more than a few hours. And even then, or even more rarely do they run for more than a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
So and what's in there is never anything important, right? The most important thing might be that's in there is like I set up a configuration to do some screenshots or recording. So setting up alerting and importantly making sure that you're getting alerts that are important and not noise is something that is super, super valuable. Getting too many alerts is almost worse than not getting any alerts. Alert fatigue is a real thing. One thing that I had never thought of that one of our field folks sent over was the concept of utilizing this watchdog alert for something useful. So if you don't know, the Alertmanager has this watchdog alert. It is always firing, right? And you can use it to test things like alerts. Hey, I want to make sure that my email config is right, or my PagerDuty config is right, or whatever it happens to be. Tag the watchdog alert, and since it's always firing, it'll fire an alert. So what they suggested was using something, and I had never heard of this before, Dead Man's Snitch, which is a strange name. So simple cron job monitoring service, right? So basically what this does is it's so long as it's receiving this alert, it doesn't do anything. It's when it no longer receives that alert that it sends off a message saying that something has happened. So it's one of those maybe the cluster fell off the network or something like that. It's one of those in the absence of anything else, something's happening over there. Maybe you should go take a look.
It's too quiet. The
yeah.
kids are bad.
Yeah. Our Hope 9. Don't worry about the watchdog. Beware the owner. Waleed, is there a way between PV claim retention policy, somewhere between delete and retain? That is, if the PVC is deleted and is released and can be bounded in. Yeah, so they used to call that, what was the name of that? PV reclaim policy. So there used to be and I thought it was deprecated, and it's been deprecated since 1.4. Oh, this is not the page I wanted. So there's, what am I looking for, Johnny? Not change the reclaim policy.
Yeah, because it was delete, retain, and then
Essentially,
that's what they are now, right? Delete and retain.
Yeah, So there was one where it would reuse, maybe that's what it was called, reuse the PV. And I think it only worked with file-based, with NFS-based PVs, where it would spin up a pod to basically mount the PV and do an RM-RF, and then put it back into the pool of available PVs. But it was deprecated for a very long time, and it might have been removed.
Recycle.
Recycle, thank you. Yeah. I wonder if it's still there.
It looks like it's still there.
Why? I find it hilarious that most of the first links, I guess that's what DuckDuckGo, which I think is an abstraction for Bing, sometimes comes up with strange things. So if we do a quick search here, yeah, recycle is there. Oh, that's good to know. Yeah, it's reclaim policy or recycle policy is deprecated. And again, it has been since as far back as I can remember. Like, I don't think I first really started paying attention until 1.6 when CSI first became beta. And it was deprecated like back then. And here you can see, here's the PV recycler pod definition, and it's just going to go in and do, an RM-RF with a scrub to make sure that it's a secure delete. So pretty straightforward. Maybe that'll meet your use case there, Waleed. Yeah, back with mutually sliced mounts. Yeah, you can still do that with the NFS provisioner, I think. The unofficial NFS provisioner. It basically mounts one NFS export and then creates folders inside of there for each one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. Last one. Let's see. The last one that we had here was antivirus. I thought this was an interesting one because it was also very controversial. Sometimes we have security teams, right, who are, I'm not going to say they're behind the times, but they are very set in their ways and, their policies. And their policies are, well, we have an antivirus agent on every single node of every single operating system of everything that's in the data center, right? And that doesn't really work well in something like OpenShift, where CoreOS is an appliance. And not just any appliance, it's an appliance where it's actively difficult to go in and do something like an RPM install. So it was interesting to me that the conversation kind of ranged between, just bite the bullet and do it, and, work with the antivirus vendor, and hopefully they have something like a daemon set. So that way you can easily deploy that, to the cluster without having to worry about like some crazy machine config or customizing the image or something like that. Which, keep an eye on the What's Next tomorrow. There's some interesting news about being able to customize CoreOS, I think, that they'll be talking about. So yeah, it's one of those. Do we bite the bullet and do we just do it, or is there some other better way? And one of the folks actually had a really interesting point, and that was, if we think about it, what's the goal of an antivirus, right? To detect anomalies, to see when something strange is happening that we don't expect. And there's other tools, other things that we can use to get very similar results. Things like ACS. Now that I think about it, I wonder if they weren't one of the ACS people.
They played you.
Yeah. So, what are the best ways? What's a Kubernetes native way of finding and detecting that anomalous behavior? We used to call it heuristics. Right now, I think the fancy term is like machine learning assisted or something like that. But looking for this pod always communicates with this service. Why all of a sudden is it now going outside of the cluster and talking to something? Using that type of stuff to identify those workloads. Another one that I found interesting, talking to the folks who run like the OpenShift Sandbox and the OpenShift Learning. If you're not familiar, you can go to learn.openshift.com. I'll redirects over to developers. But if you come down here and go to the interactive lessons, like this OpenShift 4.9 playground, and it'll drop me into an actual running OpenShift environment after 16 minutes while it provisions it. They've done like massive amounts of work in these services to do things like find crypto miners that work their way into these resources and all of that. So again, it's anomaly detection. So back to my original point here, antivirus. I understand that sometimes we have policies and the policy says we must do this. And the best option is to work with our antivirus vendor to see if they have a Kubernetes native way of doing it, right? A daemon set or something like that. But it may be more effective. And certainly the whole defense in depth thing, use an additional tool to see if you can identify those anomalies happening at the application layer. Whether that's something like ACS, there's a whole bevy of other partners that all of their names are escaping me because I didn't write them down like I meant to, that offer similar capabilities, depending on what it is that you that you're interested in doing. So, according to our security team, ACS is not very clear on digital forensics and incident response. Interesting. I don't know anything about that, but I know somebody who does. Sysdig, yep. Sysdig is a good one. Datadog, I think, is another one. So yeah, we can. Mike Foster is the ACS expert that I typically interact with, and they have a live stream as well. So we can maybe we can pounce on them the next time that they have a stream and ask them some questions. Waleed.
Falco is another one that you could use as part of the CNCF too. They do you can set up rules and stuff like that. It's almost like AID, I think.
Yep. Let's see. Carlos, in a public cloud, do you recommend any strategies of security when I expose my applications? I don't have any specific strategies or recommendations. I will say that is 85% because I don't feel knowledgeable enough on the subject to make smart recommendations. So anything that I suggest is going to be, secondhand at best. And, I think it's probably a topic for, maybe we can bring back Kirsten and talk about that, or invite Mike Foster on again, that type of stuff to have that conversation. The other 15% is I'm hesitant because for me, most of my experience is on-prem. So I'm not familiar with the full set of tools that are available in a public cloud to help protect against that. Johnny, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of depends on where you're at. I mean, I think AWS has a firewall capability, but Azure definitely has one that works pretty well that you could use. Honestly, the big thing, the easy things are going to be certificates, right? Make sure that you've got a legit SSL cert on your app. And then if you're using AWS, you could do not VPC peering, but where there's another term for it that I can't remember, where you essentially run through another VPC. And that way you're essentially you have a filter in front of you that's allowing you to go through. That's probably the best path.
Waleed, thank you for bringing up that the chat or the screen share isn't there most of the time. I just switched over and I'm looking at the Twitch stream, and I see the same thing. So Stephanie, your concerns here on the back end were valid because I'm not seeing it either. So yeah,
yes.
Yeah, we'll figure out what's going on there, Waleed, and see if we can get it fixed. Unfortunately, it'll be that way in the recording, but let's see. I thought I saw one other message in here. Stephen Reeves, love the NFS subdir provisioner for Home Lab. Yeah, I used to use it all the time too. It was my primary provisioner for a lot of things until I started experimenting with OpenShift virtualization. And then having a CSI provisioner that was capable of doing clones became very useful. Because now I can just clone the disk for a virtual machine very quickly. All right. Well, I don't see any other chat. I think we've worked through our list here. There's one or two kind of minor, I'm going to say, expansions of things that we've talked about here. I'll get those in the blog post. I've got this big bulleted list in our notes document. We'll include all of that stuff in the blog post. That way we can get as much of this out into your hands as possible, including links wherever appropriate. I know we linked a bunch of stuff today and it's scattered throughout the stream, so we'll consolidate everything inside of the blog post and make sure that we get all of that stuff out there. So just a quick reminder, tomorrow, what's next? The roadmap presentation for OpenShift at 10 a.m. Eastern time, right here on the OpenShift YouTube channel and the Twitch channel. I don't think that goes out across the Red Hat YouTube channel, but just keep an eye out for that. We'll be publishing it on social media and all that other stuff as well. And with that, I hope everybody has a great week. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. Thank you for all of the great chat, all the great questions. This has been really phenomenal. Johnny and I both get excited when we can answer questions like that. It's one of the favorite things about doing this.
It's the perk, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So thank you as always, Stephanie, behind the scenes, and thank you, Johnny. And I will leave you with the last word.
Great show today. Thank you to everybody out asking all the questions. You know, a lot of interesting topics, and learned a lot as usual. So I'll be here tomorrow to help answer some questions, and see you next week. Thanks, Stephanie. You're awesome.